All right, everybody. Well, welcome to our weekly ongoing coaching meeting. So glad that you're joining us today. Look forward to these each week. And as I was saying, over the last couple of weeks, we've been bringing in outside voices to encourage us and to challenge us as all of us are pursuing movements wherever in the world we may be. And so I'm so excited about our guest that's agreed to come and join us today. Many of you already know him, so he doesn't need much of an introduction. If you've been in the movement world for a while, you've heard his name. And his name is Curtis Sargent. He is a movement catalyst who's catalyzed movements long before any of us knew probably what they were or were talking about them in the 90s. He was a missionary in China with the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he went to a place there in China in his early days of doing ministry overseas where there were only 100 known Christians. And Curtis, on your website, I calculated that 17 years later, you said there were over 500,000 followers of Christ. He started a Metacamp, which is here in the U.S., to, in his words, provide an experiential learning environment for reproductive disciple making. He's also an author of a book called The Only One: Living Fully in, By, and For God. So you'll definitely want to pick up a copy of that. He created Zume. Many of you guys have been helped by Zume, encouraged by Zume. This is Mr. Zume right here. He's spent a lot of time creating Zume, which is a fantastic resource. It's a 10-week online training that helps people learn how to make and multiply disciples in simple churches. And then you may know him also as one of the facilitators, along with Stan and some others, of the 2414 network. So Curtis, brother, we are so excited to have you come and hang out with us today. And you guys, I asked Curtis if he would just take us all the way back, because so many of us are standing on the shoulders of people like Curtis and what God was sharing with them and what they were seeing even in the early 90s. And so I've asked him to kind of share his movement journey and maybe start at the beginning as he sees it of kind of modern movements and just how he got from there to here, because a lot of awesome things have happened and he was there for it. And so he can share with us about it. So Curtis, thanks for joining us today. We'll let you share for a little bit and then we'll ask you some questions.
Okay. Just to preface my comments with a caveat, obviously this is anytime you're trying to summarize a history, it's a very subjective process. And I'm totally confident that it is, from my personal perspective, the quote that everyone's the hero of their own story kind of a thing. But I'll do the best I can to summarize maybe some of the key building blocks. So, and also I can only talk about people that I know and I've worked with. So, it's limited from that perspective. I would say one building block that was helpful was 1974 Lausanne Conference, the work or the speaking done by Ralph Winter and others that helped start the awareness of what they were calling hidden peoples, but trying to overcome the emphasis on viewing the task as geopolitical nations. That was a significant precursor. Similarly, I would say George Patterson's work helping to popularize the concept of obedience-based discipleship was a helpful building block. Maybe 1985, when David Barrett, who was an Anglican missions researcher, went to, or in 85, he published, or 80 rather, sorry, 1980, he published the first edition of the World Christian Encyclopedia. And that really provided a way to specifically estimate people groups' access to the gospel. And that became an important building block for the concepts that we use. And then in 85, he went to the International Mission Board to work at the Global Research Department there. And was there from 85 till 93. And it was during that time that the concept of the non-residential missionary was developed, largely under his leadership. And that became, again, a helpful building block for what we do. Then maybe 1989, when Jim Montgomery first sort of, he wrote the book Dawn 2000, 7 Million Churches to Go, and developed kind of a pattern for saturation church planting that I think was a helpful precursor. And then in 1987, while David Barrett was still at the IMB and the concept had been developed for the non-residential missionary, they started doing some initial research, and specifically Bill Smith got involved as sort of doing some of that early legwork. And then in December of 89, he essentially became the first official non-residential missionary. And so he and Susan began working among the Zhuang. And then later in 1992, the NRM, program was then renamed as strategy coordinators. So in 1990, Keith Parks established Cooperative Services International. Well, it was officially already established, but he kind of hijacked it. It was a platform for English teachers in China, and he sort of hijacked it and expanded it to be the base for sort of a skunk works for then Foreign Mission Board, later International Mission Board work in restricted access countries. And so CSI then became I guess skunk works may be the best term for it, in which the movement approaches were developed. So that in some senses was, kind of a more direct start to the history. By 1995, there were 3 people within CSI that had started seeing, they were the first known church planting movements using the approaches, that we refer to by that name. So that would have been Bruce Carlton among the Khmer in Cambodia, David Watson among the Bhojpuri in India, and then myself among the Hainanese people on Hainan Island in China. And so by 95, the fruit from those 3 movements was over half of all the reported fruit in the IMB. So it started getting people's attention. And so shortly after that, specifically 1996, my work had kind of saturated the people group earlier. So I left my work because it didn't need me anymore, and joined Bill Smith in conducting strategy coordinator trainings, which began as part of that to equip people in church planting movement approaches. So from 1996 through 2002, we co-trained 52 one-month sessions, most of them in a different country. Each month we would have 30 participants per month, and it was a very narrow audience for the trainees. It had to be people who were long-term workers among an unreached people group in a restricted access nation, and had approval from their, their supervisors to pursue this type of approach. And if they were IMB person, they had to agree to become trainers of these approaches within their agencies. So across those 52 trainings, we trained people in over 300 different agencies who then, developed their own training programs. And so in that training, Bill trained in networking and a lot of the history, the philosophy, and I did the church planting, leadership development, strategy sessions. And so those 1 month, sessions ended up equipping a large percentage of the catalysts for the first generations of or second generations of CPMs. Then I might jump to 1997. CSI was disbanded. That's Cooperative Services International, that had kind of spawned the early movements, was disbanded due to politics, basically, within the International Mission Board and the Southern Baptist Convention. So that sort of marked the end of the era where the IMB dominated the development of movement approaches, because now we were getting all these other organizations doing it, and the relative, emphasis within the IMB was decreasing due to some political occurrences. I might jump all the way up to 2005, and that might not be the exact year, but it's close. When David Watson went to City Team, and which now is functioning as New Generations, and helped them transition their agency from non-movement orientation to movement orientation. And so the reason I think that's significant is, as far as I know, that would be the first example of an agency that entirely moved their work to a movement approach. Prior to that, there would be individuals within an agency that would do that. But as far as I know, that was the first. And then shortly after that, there were multiple other examples of that. So, for example, my work at E3 was right after that. Bill Smith going to East West Ministry, Kent taking over as president at Beyond, Frank Shatner and myself working with Team Expansion, myself at Big Life, and so on. So now there are a number of agencies that's the case, but I think David was the first, I believe. Then some other maybe notable developments. In 2013, Frank Shatner pulled together a group of practitioners to form something called the Jonathan Project, that had a goal of planting 1 million churches among 1,000 people groups in 10 years. And it was sort of a precursor of 2414. So the 2414 is like the same thing, but much broader in its inclusion. But so Jonathan Project was an early effort that direction. I might also mention maybe 2015 as sort of the formal development of media to movement approaches out of a team I equipped in North Africa. And that has become, a significant factor in catalyzing work in some places. 2017, Zume was developed, which was kind of a first effort at online training at scale. Later in 2017, Steve Smith, and it was basically his brainchild, and he joined up with Stan Parks, who's like his best friend, and they started doing the groundwork for the launch of 2414, which is a coalition of movement practitioners globally. So a much broader effort than that Jonathan project, several years earlier. And so the pre-work was pulling together a lot of movement leaders in 2 global meetings and talking about the possibilities. And then I believe it was late that year that we launched. And at launch, Steve and Stan and myself were serving as the 3 co-facilitators for that. And of course, Steve has subsequently passed away. But one way I look at 2414 is I think that's a really important development in the history of movements, largely because in a sense it coalesces a lot of the fragments that were created when we did that broad training under, with all of the different people equipped as trainers that were, each of them developing their own idiosyncrasies and specific patterns and all of that. And there was really no effort at all made on maintaining contact with all of those. But 2414 is in a sense an effort to re-aggregate sort of a lot of those streams, or as many as possible. So that was a big thing. In terms of more recent things, it's hard to know what's going to end up being historically significant, but Fidelis Project is an online, it's online, but it's done in learning cohorts, seminary that's entirely based on movements and movement approaches, and it's a degree program that's available. In 2021 also, we're seeing the first that I know sort of well-known seminary requiring movement training to expose all of their students to it. So Dallas Theological Seminary started requiring that in 2021, which, may become a trend. We'll see. I think there started being more recognition of, movement people in the broader evangelical world in disciple making organizations and church planning organizations, where it's starting, rank and file people throughout the church now are starting to be aware of it. And that started, I think becoming more evident and public in 2022, perhaps. Another trend that's been really important, but I don't know how you could possibly say when it started, because it really started at the very beginning, but was a transition between movements starting from outside catalysts versus movements starting movements in contiguous or near culture groups. But one example of it that's fairly large more recently would be our work through Metacamp that Chris mentioned. So in October 2012, when I started focusing some of my time on the US, we planted a church on our back porch here in this house where I'm sitting. And March of 2013, we did a training in our living room, and that was the first official Metacamp. And as through the first 10 years, just of those who voluntarily, report on their downline work after they're trained and coached by us, we've seen over 3 million house churches and right at 29 million baptisms in 10 years. So all of those would be starting movements, and that's in 164 countries. So that's one example of a trend that's clearly changed, the typical pattern of starting new work, because the early efforts were mainly outside catalysts. So that would be a very quick stab at some maybe key points in the history of the development of movements.
Curtis, that's so helpful. I know we've probably got tons of questions, so let me start with some of mine. So, what was the development, Curtis, in the early '90s when that group formed out of the IMB? Did you call it? What were the three letters?
Cooperative Services International.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So, what was the discovery, Curtis, at that time by you, David, and the other guy you mentioned? What changed? What did y'all do differently? What because IMB has had missionaries out for many years. What changed in your mind, either in mindset or practice or whatever, that you think was partly could be partly attributed to the growth that you guys saw in the subsequent years?
Yeah. In terms of the general environment, it took off a lot of limitations that had been, set for personnel previously. So, for example, the whole idea of not thinking in terms of what I can do, but in terms of what needs to be done. Well, that's a completely different thing. So from a personal perspective, when I went in then, I wasn't thinking, how can I start a church? And then how can I help that church multiply? I was thinking, what will it take to saturate this people group? So I literally took a big map, and of the area where my people lived, and I put 5,000 push pins in at very specific locations that were color coded according to what I believed would be the natural way for them to unfold generationally. And that was my goal. That's a very different thing than what most missionaries had been sent out to do, right? They would be sent out to lead people to Christ, then form them into churches, and just see how far you get. Well, if that's what you're aiming for, probably that's something like what you're going to get. But if you're aiming for complete saturation of this people group, that's a totally different thing. And, like in restricted access areas, everybody recognizes the challenges because you have to work covertly and all of that. But on the other hand, relative to the church, it tends to be much more of a blank slate, tabula rasa kind of a situation. So you're not competing so much with differing ideas, about what the church looks like, or, overcoming resistance from existing Christian work if they disagree or feel threatened, by what you're doing, or so on. And so in some ways, I think it's potentially a more fruitful, place to work if that's where you're focused, which the early efforts were. I think, just very practically speaking, previous work, like in my case in China, there's a big emphasis on doing everything completely legally. Well, it happens there are very specific laws against specific things that God clearly commands us to do, and in ways he commands us to do it. And if you're fully following the letter of the law of China, your hands are tied. And so there wasn't a, an insistence that we work entirely according to the laws of the land. If God commanded something else, then we would obey him rather than men. And so there's, all of these ways that the environment within CSI created the possibility for us to pursue than what happened.
Yeah, I love that. And Curtis, I've heard Stan talk about this some too, and you gave a more extensive description of it. But what role did Matthew 10 and Luke 10 play in those early days? Because I've heard just that man of peace principle kind of came up with multiple guys that were pursuing this. Can you give me, tell how did that come to the surface, and how was that principle impactful at that point?
Yeah, so that kind of approach in all three of the cases with Bruce, David, and myself, we all came to that. And people say, well, were you guys collaborating or whatever? In our case, we were on the island, not coming off, and had no telephone, no mail service, so we had zero communication with any Westerner for a year at a time. And so, it's pretty clear there wasn't collaboration, at that point. But I think how the means by which that got popularized was actually not through any of the three of us, but through somebody who knew all of us and then later started really putting that together in a very emphatic way was Tom Wolfe out of Church on Brady in Los Angeles. And so he really helped do a lot to popularize, that thing that we had come to. So.
Yeah, when I've heard that story shared before, it's just powerful to me that Stan shares it like you just did, that you guys separately felt the Holy Spirit drawing you to this passage. And then I guess when you had the chance to, talk among each other to realize, oh, this was not, we weren't collaborating, the Lord was speaking, we thought, you guys thought something must be here. And then in the years that followed, it seemed like God really used that principle of finding that man of peace who then reaches their oikos and so on, or the community, was really impactful. What about, Curtis, I'll ask one or two more, and then I've got some in the chat for you here too. Back to 2414. So this group has heard that before. We've talked some about that. We have pins on, some of us have pins on the North American 2414 map. And so can you just give us an update on the progress toward the 2414 vision, kind of reminding us what that end goal is and how we're doing? You can say in the West and also globally. What's your assessment, being a facilitator of that, as to how that's going and what's really exciting about what the Lord is doing through that? What do you call it? Collaboration of movement practitioners.
Mm-hmm. So, 2414 is divided into 33 regions, 32 of them geographic, plus one globally for the deaf. And, then within those, there can be further geographic subdivisions. So in North America, for example, is US, Canada. Mexico goes in with Middle America. And so US, Canada. And then within that, there are sort of West, Central, and East, divisions to bring a little bit of, closer leadership, geographically speaking, and then work down at state level. And then ultimately the aim is down to a county level. And progress in the US even, for example, is similar to what it is globally in that it's uneven. So there are some states, like say Ohio or Indiana or Maryland, where they may be getting pretty close to having representation in every single county in the state. But there are some where, maybe we have one person that we know of in an entire state, and so there's this huge range of how we're doing. Generally, on the global level, some of the best performing regions would be maybe South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa would be some of the stronger ones. But there's pretty strong work in some other places, but not as much collaboration. So, for example, a lot of North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, there's some tremendous work going on, but because of the nature of the context, the collaboration part is far less. So, I'd almost categorize it into 3 buckets. One where we're seeing fruit and a lot of collaboration, one where we're seeing fruit but not so much collaboration, and then one where there's not that much fruit. You almost could think of it in some of those ways. And I guess there'd be places where there's collaboration but no fruit, and then the fourth would be no collaboration and no fruit. So, and a particular region comes to mind when I say that. So
yeah. Curtis, remind us, some of us may not be as familiar with this. What is the stated vision of 2414? What's that goal here that we're trying to reach in a couple of years? I think it's it's one of the most exciting visions I've ever heard or been a part of. And so I'd love you to articulate what is that exact vision that we're all partnering together to see.
So by the end of 2025, we're seeking to have initial engagements in every people group and every place by collaborative efforts through movements. So, some of those are definitely distinctives. So like, there might be other groups that talk about engagement, but not necessarily with movements. There's some that are about collaboration and kind of wherever that can happen. But I think 2414 is a bit unique in that it's movements and collaboration and, saturation. So.
Yes, very exciting, you guys. And 2414now.net, Curtis, correct? 2414now.net is where you can learn more. You can connect with the North American 2414 group. Many of you know Lee Wood. Curtis, he's still heading up the North American 2414 group. Lee and some other guys. One of the guys on our team, Tyler, is a part of that facilitation team. So let's definitely connect with those of us that are working here in North America with the 2414 efforts here in North America. Curtis, there's some questions about the West. A lot of us are working in the West. You've got folks here, representing many states across the U.S. and even I see multiple countries here, Canada. We've got, I'm sure, Europe and some other places in the West. So David's asking in the chat, he's from Maryland, so he's rejoicing at what you said about Maryland a minute ago with saturation. But he's asking, what are the top 2 or 3 things you would suggest we catalysts here in the U.S. be doing to see movement? What are the top 2 or 3 things you would suggest, David's asking, that those of us wanting to see movements here should be doing in order to see movement?
Wow. That's a broad question because this is a big country. Maybe rather than making broad statements, I'll pick some that may apply to some people, but I think some people definitely need to pay attention to. One would be considering specific targets, such as young people. They're like middle school, high school, up through college age people. I've seen some remarkable response among that demographic. even here in the US. Another one that seems particularly responsive but has its challenges would be prisons and addiction recovery communities. Both of those can be very frustrating because there's a lot of 3-step forward, 2-step back. But there's something culturally in those target groups that seems particularly responsive. There are some really remarkable things happening among immigrant communities. And so all of those would be, I think, more responsive than average segments within US. One general piece of advice I have for people working in the US is I refer to it as keeping one foot in each world, and that is one foot in the world of the harvest among unchurched people who haven't had access to the gospel type of people, and then winning people from that context and discipling them multiplicatively. And the second being working with those who are interested from existing churches, organizations, and so on. And I believe there's great potential in both approaches, but for any given person, usually you're going to end up with more weight on one side of that or the other, whether it's from your experience, your giftings, whatever. But I think it's helpful for everyone to at least keep a little effort on both sides of that equation, so that you can, first of all, you may find a breakthrough that you didn't expect, but then secondly, it helps you relate to the other side of the equation. So like if you're working with existing churches, you still need to be able to coach them from personal experience in what's working and what isn't in the fruit just out of the harvest. Similarly, if you're just working in fruit out of the harvest, it makes it difficult to know how to help that fruit relate to existing churches if you have no relationships and no contact in that world. And so to do it well, maintaining some level of contact in both of those worlds, I think is important for everybody. Since a lot of this group, at least as I understand it, are people out of prevailing model churches, I would say that an important aspect of if you're trying to impact churches or organizations, not just individuals from within them, that you're not going to ever see significant success, I don't think, if the goal isn't helping everyone in that church or organization be a practitioner at some level. You can definitely still have great fruit and progress with individuals, just who are working with the willing. But if you're wanting to impact the whole organization, it really, I think, the goal needs to be kind of the saturation, similar to the macro strategy I was talking about, with trying to start one church versus trying to saturate a region. So those would be 3 general comments.
Curtis, that's helpful. Let's keep talking about the West for a minute if we can. Another question I kind of had is, as you've seen movement catalysts overseas and characteristics of these men and women that are catalyzing movements and multiplying disciples fruitfully and multiplying churches fruitfully. And then you look in the West at people that are trying to do the same thing. What can we learn from our brothers and sisters in Christ overseas that are doing this, that maybe we don't know growing up in a context where, to give an example from my reading and understanding what's going on overseas, when I started, Curtis, learning some about movements and reading about brothers and sisters around the world catalyzing them, it made me feel prayerless. And I thought I prayed quite a bit, but I recognize they're just desperate for God, and they just pray with such, passion and earnestness for God to move in their area. And I felt like maybe that was kind of even missing in my life. So as you just think about catalysts overseas, and those of us on this call, Curtis, wanting to be catalysts, what can we learn? What mindset shifts do we need to make, maybe that we grew up with, that we don't even realize is problematic or potentially hinders multiplication? Does that question make sense, Curtis? Just what can we learn?
Yeah, maybe I'm going to rephrase it slightly so that I can maybe answer more directly. Are there cultural tendencies here that might hinder some of what we're seeing over there? I know that's not exactly what you asked, but it's related. So one thing that is a cultural tendency in the US, I think, is kind of this spiritual secular bifurcation, right? So it's like we think, this part of our life is our spiritual life, and this part of our life is our, everything else that we do, as opposed to having, more of a kingdom view, that everything I do is an expression of my kingdom identity, within the kingdom of God. And if we get seduced by our culture into thinking that way, yeah, it's going to be really unlikely that we'll see movements. Maybe related to that is our idea of time, and how we spend time and how we prioritize our time. And everybody has 24 hours in a day. Everybody has 7 days in a week. God knows our capabilities. He knows our giftings. He knows what he intends for us to do. So if we don't have enough time to do what we think he wants us to do, either we're misunderstanding what he wants us to do, or we're doing some things in addition to what he wants us to do. Right? So we have sort of this idea culturally, just broadly speaking, that my time is mine. And sure, there's some things I have to do, but I'm going to make sure I have time to do what I want to do. Well, if that's in addition to what God desires, you're not going to have enough time. He designed us for rest. He designed us, for all of these things that need to be part of what he called us to, and for specific tasks, right? He made us for specific good works that he has prepared beforehand for us to do. In Ephesians, it tells us that. And so our view of time sometimes mitigates against, how we invest our hours, minutes, and seconds. So those would be two kind of, big things. Clearly, there are competing models here that, and then our cultural tendency to be creative, right? To adapt to whatever, makes it really challenging to have any consistency or standards within a movement. So a lot of places that have more of a communal or group identity awareness kind of have an advantage over us, because we tend to be far more individualistic in our views and planning. And so again, that's a challenge, because so much of movement is me serving others, me sacrificing for others, me making decisions and investing my time and energy for the benefit of others. And that's not as likely to happen in a more individualistic setting.
Curtis, I totally agree. I think that's so helpful. Thank you. Hey, let me pitch two more to you, and then we'll send everybody to breakouts to discuss this a little bit more. But would love you to maybe share what you're excited about with movement activity in the West. Maybe they're not two movements, but you're seeing some multiplication somewhere that's exciting. And then maybe globally, what's exciting you today about what the Lord is doing through movements around the world?
So I'll share one just specific movement example, and then one just general trend. So the specific example, surprisingly, would be among immigrant communities in North Dakota. So last month alone, there were over 1,000 baptisms, and considering the population of North Dakota, and especially in terms of their, immigrant population, is not that great. And they think they're around 6,000 total now, and it just started the second half of last year there. So that's pretty good, going from 0 to 6,000 in that amount of time anywhere, not just in the US. In terms of a general trend, I think we're at a really critical point in potential adoption of movement approaches in the US. So I would say we've done a pretty good job with the innovators and early adopters, but most practitioners in the US, that's who they are. They're either innovators or early adopters. And kind of in the APEST roles, right? They're mostly apostles with some prophets and some evangelists, but not very many shepherds and teachers. And part of that, there's multiple reasons that I think are part of that, but part of it is for the shepherds and teachers particularly, and some of the prophets to a degree too, the qualitative advantages of the movement approach are super important, and they haven't been talked about that much. Relatively speaking, people have paid more attention to the quantitative advantages. Well, it's not that those, shepherds, teachers, and some of the prophets aren't concerned with quantity, but they're clearly more concerned with quality. And so I think there's starting to be more emphasis on that. And yeah, I don't have time to go into it, but there's some sociological reasons that I think we're at this critical juncture. And if we succeed in crossing into early majority, late majority type of audiences, that the work could progress really quickly in the US, which would be wonderful, right? It would be amazing. And so I'm kind of watching that, hoping for that, and cautiously optimistic about that.
Amen, Curtis. Thank you. And Curtis, just on behalf of all of us, thank you for all that you've done in coaching, training, Zume. Just can we give him a round of applause, a virtual round of applause, just for joining us today? And he's just provided so many resources that have been helpful to all of us. And so, Curtis, I hope you'll come back and hang out with us again. Gonna say something? Go ahead.
I'll put in the chat Zume in case people aren't familiar with it. I might mention that our same Zume team has some other resources that you might find helpful, like prayer.global, prayformovement.com, kingdom.training, disciple.tools. There are a lot of different aspects that are related. And then secondly, I'll put a link for the book that you mentioned where you can get the ebook for free.
Okay.
And in case somebody's interested. So I'll put those in the chat. Thanks.
Great.